presented by Diaspora Fine Art. I'd just like to briefly introduce you to Diaspora Fine Art. It's founded to highlight the beauty and diversity of art created by people of African descent, not only in Africa, but in the diaspora as well. The mission of Diaspora Fine Art is to foster pride and meaningful connections like what we are going to have here during the art talk, while adding value to artists, their local communities, and collectors as well. Our programming is very interesting. It comprises of emphasizing accessibility, diversity of mediums, and we also have a profit sharing model that directly impacts artists. So again, a warm welcome to you to our art talk. I would like you to introduce you to our wonderful guest for our second edition. Our guest is Dr. Debbie Yeboah. Dr. Debbie, you are most welcome to our art talk.
Thank you so much.
Yes. I just want to inform viewers of the title of our art talk if they if they don't know about it yet. We are going to discuss coloniality and the fractured self. Coloniality and the fractured self. Ghanaian art praxis as repair. So it's going to be a very interesting dialogue and conversation we are going to have. And I hope you will enjoy yourself. If you want to ask questions, you are free to ask questions. I think there's a comment section available for you to ask all the questions that you have. And a wonderful welcome again. Dr. Debbie, you are welcome.
Thank you so much.
I would like you to introduce yourself and then also let us know more about your work.
Okay.
From your experience-wise, your practice.
Okay. So, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak to everyone today. Basically, a lot of the times when I introduce myself, I say that I'm an artist, a researcher, and an educator. I would consider myself to be an interdisciplinary scholar. And really all of the work that I do ties around these three areas and sometimes extends into others, actually. So in terms of my art practice, I would say that it's mostly generated from my research practice. A lot of what I do research-wise came back to my time teaching art, actually, in Ghana. I'm from Ghana. I happened to do my PhD in education at the University of Cambridge and finished almost 2 years ago now, it seems. So essentially, a lot of the research that I did stems back to my time teaching. Basically, while I was teaching art in Ghana, I realized that most of the content that we were learning basically comes from a British context, right? And the content was almost completely Eurocentric. And this is something that I myself experienced, when I was learning art, right? You learn about Michelangelo, you learn about Raphael, Picasso, and you don't learn anything about the local context. So my students one day, when I asked, okay, who's the most famous artist that you can, you can think of? And the answers were pretty predictable, right? The first names were the ones I just mentioned. And then when I asked them, okay, who's your favorite Ghanaian artist? Who's your favorite African artist? Nobody could mention a single name. So that was when I confirmed that there was a huge problem, right? But ultimately, what I realized was that the problem isn't just in content. And I think a lot of The decolonial solutions that we have these days are, okay, let's create another curriculum, which most of the time is not going to be, unfortunately, adopted in the schools that we want it to be, right? There
Yeah.
have been, some good curriculum interventions, but one of the things we have to think about first is what's going on in the mind, right? What are teachers bringing to the classroom? What internalized biases, what
Yeah.
inferiority, what comparisons, to the things that we value, usually being European or foreign. Um, Essentially, we're coming into, uh, classrooms, but not just classrooms, our daily lives with this internalized fracturing, right? This is why I talk a lot about the ways in which coloniality fractures us. And when I say coloniality, I'm not just talking about colonization. So, colonization is something that I locate in a historical moment, right? So, that is to say, this is something that happened in history. In Ghana, for example, were colonized by many European powers, ending with the British. And that has had an impact and that has left a legacy. But in addition to that, we have to think about the current structure of power in the world, right? Who determines what we consider to be valid knowledge? Who structures what we learn? Who
Yeah.
uh, determines the things that we think of as beautiful or valuable? And so all of that internalized uh, kind of knowledge, but also internalized ways of sensing and perceiving the world, then has to be addressed, right? Before we even get to a
Yeah.
curriculum solution.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, you give somebody a new curriculum and they're coming at it with old eyes, they're still going to continue to reinforce the same patterns
Yeah.
that we had before. So what I tried to do in my research and moving forward has been to think, okay, how can if there are certain ways that knowledge is being structured and prioritized, and art has become a tool of Western and Eurocentric domination. How can we flip that on its head? How can we use art as a crucial tool to decolonize? And what does that look like
Yeah.
using art practice and also using art as a way to engage us differently? Um, so essentially, yeah, my work thinks about how to actually use the process of making art and the process of, engaging with contemporary African art in particular as this way to shift um, perspectives and the ways that we sense the world. And through that, essentially, my art practice has expanded into several different media. Uh, I mean, I paint, I draw, make mixed media works, make installational works. Um, yeah. And so, yeah, basically, this is what I do. In addition to that, of course, because I continue to do research, I end up working with lots of different organizations that are interested in this sort of not just inclusive work, but like disruptive work in different areas. So perhaps we can come to that later.
Yeah. But before that, I just want us
Mm,
to go into details
okay.
because there are certain vocabularies that
Yeah.
you are using that are very new to some
Okay.
of us. The how to deconstruct
Mm,
coloniality, how do
mm,
we decenter
mm,
coloniality, and how do we heal from coloniality?
mm,
Because these are the three words you've expressly spoken about right now. So
mm, mm.
if you can delve further on that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the three moves that you've mentioned are the center of the methodology that I created. Um, so the three steps that I was essentially exploring as a way to pivot us away from this fracturing are, as you said, deconstruction, decentering, and healing. Now, to me, what deconstruction means is looking at the current situation and thinking about how we got there, right? So so in the context of art education in Ghana, for example, we are looking, first of all, at the current curriculum. What does it say? Where are the issues of tension? We're thinking about the histories. How did we get to this current space? So in the Ghanaian sphere, of course, we can talk about the British colonial educational system that was introduced. We can talk about the mission schools. We can talk about the
Yeah.
ways in which art was framed as a subject and what was erased, what was intentionally omitted, the ways in which art has kind of been devalued as a whole, but particularly indigenous arts have been devalued.
Yeah.
Um, and then we can, once we have a full picture of that, once we've deconstructed and we have a full picture of that, we can move to decentering. So decentering to me is essentially just what it says, right? It's taking the spotlight off of the West, and it's saying, okay, how can we reposition um, artists who have usually been marginalized, ignored, not just artists, but also ways of being, ways of knowing that we don't even consider because we've been so wrapped up in the Western ideas of what knowledge should be like, what knowledge is valid. When we think about art, we're automatically thinking, okay, what are the elements of design? What are the principles of design? But without these frameworks, are we even able to talk about art, especially knowing that art has been a part of everyday lives for cultures all over the world before it was even framed as a separate discipline or subject or thing on its own. So yeah, essentially that's what I would call the decentering move. So a lot of what happens there is very reflexive, um, which means it's important to be able to kind of have an autobiographical leaning, right? So not just on the self, but to be able to reflect on what's happening in society and the ways in which that continues to reinforce what we understand to be knowledge, and what we also understand to be, the ways in which we position ourselves in the world. And then that last move, healing, I think we've lost Kezia. That last move, healing, basically has to do with what arts can do specifically to turn the tide, right? So for me, that includes two things. So that is, what can art practice as an artist do to shift what knowledge is? So in this case, we're thinking, how can knowledge be embodied in art, in the artwork itself, but also more importantly, in my opinion, in the making of it, right? So what ways can we conceptualize differently? How can we reflect on experiences that we've had and reshape them? How can we, when we're engaging with African contemporary art, whether it explicitly has or engages issues of coloniality or decoloniality, how essentially can the artwork teach? How can it teach us to live differently, to think of ourselves differently, to reposition ourselves in the world differently? Yeah, so essentially these are the three moves that I have thought of as a methodology of decoloniality. I would say on the last move, when it comes to healing, what was really helpful for me was thinking about certain concepts. So a lot of what I did, of course, when you're doing a PhD, is to conceptualize, new ideas. Um, and I found it really helpful to I guess pivot around certain experiences or observations that I had made. One, for example, you may see repeated in a lot of my artwork is this motif of hair. So this first started with me thinking, okay, how can I how can I think about coloniality in a way that is very specific to the Ghanaian context? So in Ghana, you can't really think about coloniality in the same way that you would, for example, if you're thinking about the UK context, right? Where you have, um, you know, people who have been from previously colonized countries, for example, living amongst the quote unquote colonizers. Um, when you're thinking about coloniality in that context, it won't be the same as when you're thinking about a place like Ghana, where technically the colonizer has left. However, we still find ourselves almost, self-policing and creating um, a sort of inferiority complex that isn't determined externally, but is continuing to be, I guess, determined by the ways in which, the ways in which we position ourselves in regards to the West. So, um, essentially, what ends up happening, coming back to this idea of hair as an allegory, I began to think, okay, one common experience that we've probably all had, or many of us have had, was, having to relax our hair, when we were
Yes.
young. And, literally being burnt and scarred, just in an effort to look, more Eurocentric, to have hair that was tamer, that was neat.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this was just an example to me of the ways in which coloniality actually wreaks havoc on the body. It
Yeah.
has physical implications, right? It's not just an abstract thing. So to me, this idea of, the actual protein structure of hair being broken down was
Mm-hmm.
a really interesting analogy for how coloniality breaks down the self and the body, really. Um, and so through that, I came up with my dual concepts of denaturation and renaturation, borrowing from biochemistry, and essentially began to think about, these ways in which um, we can counter that through Afrofuturist work. So looking at the work of artists who are also thinking about the body, who are
Mm-hmm.
not subjugating it, but are positioning it in a way that is, I would say, more elevated, higher, but also that counters this kind of, how would I put it? Um, I want to be careful not to go into like eugenic language when we're talking
Mm.
about science. Um, but essentially, thinking about how we heal by creating new futures, for
Mm.
ourselves. How can we position ourselves in new ways that haven't been thought of before? Um, and yeah, I mean, essentially, this work is always going to be speculative in that we're going to continue to be imagining
Yes.
ourselves in new ways. But
Yeah.
that doesn't diminish the fact that it has concrete implications on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so I mean that's just one example of, yeah, of, I suppose, how that work happened. So of course in the artwork that I created of that time, you can kind of see some of that cellular imagery. You can see these motifs that are use my use of inversion of color.
Mm,
I was, I guess, trying to evoke this sort of scanned or X-ray imagery
mhm,
in some of the pieces that you might see. And some of them I've even used my own CT scans.
mm.
Um, yeah, so I think I've spoken
Yeah.
quite a lot.
Um, what comes to mind is visual healing.
Mm,
I can put it that way because when
mm,
I look at your work,
mm,
um, it doesn't, when you see the figures, there's no
mm,
specific race
mm,
or 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 no specific culture. It's
mm,
just humanness. It's human. That's what I get.
mm,
I get that
mm,
there's this sense of humanness in your work,
mm,
which doesn't reference anything else that much, especially the works that reference the X-ray
mm,
aesthetic. I feel like you see that you are talking about humanness,
mm,
not referring to anything. But then this is futuristic in itself, because now you
mm,
have elevated your practice in such a way that we are no longer looking for gender politics that much, but we are more looking at humanness and how it is experienced.
mm,
Because what also I remember is that most of the time Africans are dehumanized.
mm,
And the dehumanization also comes from the practice itself, how
mm,
we present our practice.
mm, mm, mm.
See, it's
I,
no
I,
longer considered primitive, but at
yeah.
the same time, it's African art or it's African contemporary art. And
Mm,
let's embrace that. But at the same time, they
mm,
don't give it that humanness,
mm,
how do I say, compassion or understanding or elevation
mm.
that they give to especially European art. So I
Right,
think
right.
how you are approaching healing in that sense
Mhm,
is how I'm seeing this.
mhm,
The visual healing comes from how you present it in present your works in a human form.
mm, mm. I
So
think
this is just a
that's
contribution.
yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think that I reckon with dehumanization quite a lot in my
Mm,
work. Um, of course, we know that at the core of coloniality, or really um, most types of oppression rely on hierarchy, right?
yeah.
So those who are at the bottom, which most of the time are Black and African people, um, yes, of course, there's going to have to be dehumanization to be able to keep someone
Yeah.
at the bottom of that hierarchy. Um, but beyond that, I think what the work is trying to do, I would say that I still do locate it within Ghanaian experience. I don't think that I need to
Mm,
necessarily, throw in some Adinkra symbols for it to become,
exactly.
Ghanaian. And I don't think that I necessarily gravitate towards Black figuration in the way that I
Hmm.
think um, it has been popularized at the
Yes.
moment. Um, but I will say that I want to be very explicit in saying there isn't one way. There isn't only one way of decolonizing, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Decoloniality in itself is what Walter Mignolo would refer to as an option, right,
Hmm.
amongst others.
Yeah.
So there are different ways in which we can frame in terms, there are different terms that we can use when we're framing certain oppressions, right? We can be talking about race and racism, for example.
Yes.
um, and of course that intersects with coloniality. We can talk about misogyny, and think about gender. And I would say that my work really draws from a lot of Black feminist work, because a lot of
Hmm.
critical, theoretical work has happened in those spaces. So there are all of these interlinked um, movements. The reason why I would say my work specifically focuses on coloniality is because we're thinking about a particular context, right? So
Yeah.
the way that we think about race in Ghana is going to be completely different. And I would say, um, again, comes linked with these ideas of coloniality and, of course, our histories with enslavement, etc. So there's a complexity that needs to be addressed in this sort of
Hmm.
work, right?
Yeah.
um, it's not just one thing, but at the same time it's important that we are able to distinguish different forms of oppression from each other, so that we have a full picture of things and it's not oversimplified. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I
Yeah.
agree with you.
Mm.
And also discussing, as we are talking about the wider effect of coloniality itself,
Mhm.
when we talk about current affairs worldwide. How do
Yes.
you express community and bonding within your practice?
Hmm. I mean, I think that this moment, this current moment that we are in, it. I mean, we're always saying it's unprecedented, right?
Hmm.
And it really is, in that hmm, I think coloniality is no longer wearing a face. I think that we can see it for exactly what it is. Um, when we think about things that are happening across the world, things that are happening in the Middle East, for example, we can
Hmm.
see what coloniality actually looks like in action, right?
Yeah.
When resources, when land, when people are being not just oppressed, but murdered, we
Yeah.
can see
Genocide.
the stakes. Yes, we can see
Yeah.
the stakes of coloniality at its most extreme form. Um, so yeah, I think right now in particular is such an important moment to be doing work that is focused on healing, on uh, a kind of communal move. I think I've talked quite a bit about kind of the individual stakes of coloniality, decolonization. But when we're thinking about how this can be a communal move, and I think in particular because even just thinking about diaspora fine arts, I love the fact that there is this connection between um, the African continent and the diasporas.
Hmm.
And these conversations are so important to be had, not just to say, okay, we're acknowledging these atrocities that have happened, but to
Yeah.
really think about how we're going to move forward in a way that is um, that that is useful, and that's
Hmm.
productive, that's generative.
Hmm.
And I think using art to do that is one of the most crucial ways, because it's one of the ways that we form our idea of
Yeah.
the world, right? It's the way that we understand what is important, what is um as I think I said, what's beautiful, what sort of knowledge is being embodied in the artwork that we see. If we
Yes.
only see one type of art, how does that shift our view
Mm-hmm.
of the
Mm-hmm.
world and of ourselves? Um, and if we're able to, exchange and think about, what are the similarities between the arts of the diaspora and, of Ghana? What can be said about this current moment, looking at the two? How can we think about institutional change, um, between the two spaces? Yeah, I mean, I think those are the sorts of conversations that actually generate waves of change, rather than the diaspora wars that we're so used to. Um, yeah. So anyway, back to the communal aspects of my work, um, and coming back to this analogy of hair that runs through my work.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there's another concept that I had developed, which essentially has to do with what it would look like, to have kind of a physical and tangible manifestation of healing. So I think about braiding as an analogy for that. So, of course, for Black women and, you know, then Black men as well, having this experience of someone doing your hair is such an intimate, beautiful thing, right? Um, And I think there was just a day when I was playing around with a piece I was making, and I was just thinking about the ways in which we form these bonds, and the way that you can't. It's not the same, doing it yourself, right? I had a workshop once in Cambridge that ended up becoming a braiding workshop. Um, And while we were making these braided pieces, and people were there for the first time learning how to braid, you know, um, we were having conversations about what it means to be included in a space. What does it mean to be on the
Mm-hmm.
periphery? How does identity show up in different ways in different spaces? Um, And so, doing this decolonial work doesn't have to be, all the way up here in some, for academics and for certain people to
Mm-hmm.
do. But it's in these conversations and it's in these everyday interactions that we can begin to have these really formative conversations that shift the way that people think and relate to themselves, and the world around them, and others. Um, and it was a very beautiful moment, really having people reflect and see the ways in which they could shift their own thinking that had been so entrenched.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Hair itself is such a sensitive and
Yeah.
controversial topic in
Yeah, I mean,
itself.
hair politics, there's been so much written around
Yeah.
hair politics. Um, and, just coming back to where those ideas, certain ideas about, hair being bushy or dirty, or, where does that
Yeah.
come from? So, being able to interrogate and understand where certain things come from first. So, that deconstruction layer,
Mm-hmm.
is really important in helping us, get to the point of healing later down the line. Yeah, so a lot of these thoughts run through the work. Um, there's a there's a particular, what? No, let me not be too controversial. But yeah, I was just thinking about the ways in which we sometimes allow people and artists to engage, um, this work without full understanding and without proper sensitivity. I'm thinking of a particular exhibition I went to, uh, that was, I won't give too many details because it totally will give it away. But with certain foreign artists, certain white foreign artists who were trying to I suppose reflect on enslavement, you know, and the way it came across was incredibly problematic. Um, but this is why we have to be doing this work ourselves, right?
Yeah.
It's why these conversations across continents are vital.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
It's very true. Um, I'm just wondering in the near future,
Mhm.
how are you going to explore these ideas,
Mm.
especially in your practice, in your
Mhm. Mhm. Oh, so I have so many different ideas. Right now, I'm working on a new body of work, which is mostly focused on my braided installation pieces. Now, these pieces are a labor of love. Let me tell you, they take they take forever to make. I'm sure you've seen, the 3 meter
yes.
installation.
What material are you
That's
using
it's synthetic
exactly?
braiding hair. So
Okay,
I was like, let me.
that's controversial on its own. Synthetic.
I mean, yeah, yeah, yeah. But yes, that piece uh, came to me while I was thinking a lot about this idea, first of all, of braiding, and also this idea of threshold. So that's one of my other concepts that I built. But yeah, just thinking about liminal spaces. So by which I
Mm,
mean spaces, that are on a periphery, or spaces that you go through, and the ways in which they change you. Um,
mm,
so in particular, this was led by me considering the doors of no return, and the ways in which they weren't just a transitional point, but they were a point that actually made uh, us into a completely different um, you know thing, really. um, and the ways in which thresholds continue to change us, and the ways in which they have been used for subjugation but can also be renewed um, for transformation. So yes, I was thinking about this, not just braided threshold, but a braided space that could enclose you and hold you. Um, yeah. So with that work, I've basically been thinking about how to continue to push this idea, um, along the lines of braiding, and making sculptural forms. Um, you'll see, it continue to show up in my drawings and my paintings as well. But yeah, I'm working a lot in three-dimensional work right now,
yeah,
which is obviously a challenge, but is also very, very fun to do.
yeah. I can imagine. It
Yeah.
sounds very interesting, and also what I've seen so far looks very interesting, and it's already saying a lot. Just
Thank
seeing the
you.
braids,
Yeah.
yeah, and how you present them.
Mm,
So,
mm.
yeah. We are still having the art talk. This is Diaspora Fine Art. We are talking with Dr. Debbie Yeboah on coloniality and the fractured self, Ghanaian art praxis as repair. If you have any questions, this is the time. We are opening the floor for questions, contributions. Yeah, we are here for you. If you have any questions you want to ask, Dr. Debbie is ready to answer them. Yes, so I also want to find out, since this topic is very controversial,
Mm.
have you had any, negative response or any kind of emotional response
Mm.
to some of your theories or your work itself? Anything that, you know,
You know,
caused
that's quite interesting. I think that
antagonism?
yeah,
Antagonizing.
I think that I was actually expecting for there to be a lot more. Um, but interestingly, I think what it um, is that so many people can relate to this in different ways. I remember um, with my very first art talk when I completed my work and I had my opening. Uh, there was a lady who came up to me afterwards who I think was Bulgarian, and I mean she was tearing up,
Oh,
basically
wow.
talking about how, yeah, she basically just talking about how she could relate to the work in the sense that in the UK and some other European countries, Eastern Europeans are very marginalized. So, there were so many aspects of what I was discussing that she felt that she could relate to as well. Um, but yeah, interestingly, I think a lot of the audiences I have spoken to where I've expected people to be, oh, what do you mean European art is
Uh,
I actually haven't yet gotten a negative reaction. I would say emotional reactions, absolutely. Um,
mm,
that I think that perhaps speaks to what this work is supposed to do, right?
yeah,
It's meant to reframe the our senses, right? Our senses, our emotions, our affects.
absolutely.
Um, and so I think when people encounter the work, there is an emotional, uh, reaction. But yeah, I welcome that. I think that it's important to have work that unsettles us and allows us to think differently than we have before. I remember there was there's this older gentleman whose home I had lived in for a year while I was in Cambridge, and he was also at that opening. And I was really wondering, how he would have
Who would
received
receive
the
it?
work. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And speaking to him after, I remember him just saying, "Oh, I had goosebumps, hearing you speak and seeing the work." So it's very interesting how different audiences respond to it. Of course, when you have European or white audiences, um, yeah, I guess my expectation was some discomfort.
Mm,
Um, but no, overwhelmingly, it's people have been willing to learn. I think
that's amazing.
that's very interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they're
The question just popped in. Amy, from Amy, she's curious
okay.
about why you call your practice
Oh,
at this moment an
why
art
I call it a
practice.
praxis. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that for me, that was a more helpful way to look at it rather than thinking about this as my practice. And so something that I do, when I'm doing art. Um, I like to think of it as a praxis in that it's a way of doing life. It's a way of thinking about the world consistently. So it's not this compartmentalized thing that I do when I have my researcher or artist hat
Tap
on.
on.
Yeah. I'm continually unlearning, I'm continually reframing, I'm continually observing, and reworking and conceptualizing. And this is how I'm moving in different spaces. So when I come into my studio and I'm making art, I'm not just making art. I'm reflecting on conversations that I've had. I'm thinking about certain concepts that have come to me while I've been having these conversations. I'm experimenting with them as I'm drawing or painting or making. And so yeah, I'm living with these ideas. Yeah, yeah. I suppose that's why I would call it a praxis rather than a
Yes,
practice.
that's very beautiful.
Thank you.
So currently, let me also rephrase, since I was calling what you were doing a practice. Now that I know it's a praxis. And what a beautiful, intense, intimate, reflective praxis it is,
Oh.
which we are, I just can imagine what the future will bring
Mm.
as you evolve within it.
Mm. Mm.
So
Okay.
next question is from Abisoye. I found myself asking the question of if art can truly heal colonial trauma, or does it mainly create space for remembering and maybe confronting? I would like
Mm.
to hear your thoughts on this.
So I think that that depends on what you mean by heal. If you mean by heal that now we can move forward and everything's going to be fine, then no. This is continual work. I think one thing that I tend to tell my classes when I'm lecturing is that decolonial work is not one and done. It's not something that we can ever say, okay, now we've arrived, the colonial trauma is in the past, we can move forward. We're now in the post-colonial. This is actually one of the reasons why I try not to use the word post-colonial. I don't think that we are ever going to be post, you know, or at least not anytime soon. Um, but in terms of whether art can heal, I would argue that it can, in the sense that it is helping us not just to remember or memorialize, but it's also helping us to reframe our thoughts, our emotions, our attachments. And that I think is both this. So I suppose what Fanon would call the psychic fracturing that happens, so that like
Okay.
internal psychological, you know, aspect that has been broken, and then thinking about as well the affect, which has to do with emotions and senses. So if we, for example, are so used to seeing Western figurative art, right, that we're continually comparing to that and saying unconsciously or consciously that these artists, I think Keze, you said something similar about how certain artists are only considered African artists,
Yes.
right? Or African contemporary artists rather than just artists. Just the continual questioning and contesting and memorialization, I think, is part of it. But thinking about the ways in which creating art and engaging with art is able to shift our perspectives and our sense of value, I think is intrinsically important important in moving past the current states of trauma that we're in. That's not to say that it erases it, but it says that we are able to move forward. We're able to create alternatives, essentially what would be referred to as a pluriversal way of seeing the world, right? So not one that is entrenched in one universalized idea of what art should be or can be, or what its role is in our lives, but a more expansive one that allows us to think about arts outside of like the compartmentalized way we think of it. I don't know if that answers your question. But yeah, essentially, I think it depends on the way in which you're framing healing. If it has to do
Mhm.
with forgetting, I don't
Yeah.
think that is the. I don't think that's possible, or really um, an aim that we should be moving towards. But if you're thinking about the ways in which it's able to, I guess, suture these wounds that we have, I think there is a possibility for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Abisoye, does this answer your question? Do you have a follow-up question? Okay, not. Yes, this has been a lovely time hanging out with Dr. Debbie.
Well, I think if we have one or
If
two
there
more
are
questions.
no further questions, if you have any more questions for us, if not, this has been the second edition of our Art Talk, and we've been having this beautiful and insightful conversation with Dr. Debbie Yeboah, who is a Ghanaian artist currently based in London. She's a researcher and educator.
Mm,
Thank you so much, Dr. Debbie, for being with us.
thank you.
And
Thank you.
for
This was,
allowing us have such a very interesting.
I really enjoyed this. I really
Yes,
enjoyed
I think we
it.
really have to maybe do a follow up
I think so too.
ad
I
hoc.
think so.
Maybe this time it will be in person
I was actually going to say that we have
with
to
a
have
live
something in
audience.
in Accra.
That would be
In
very
Accra.
interesting.
Oh, I'm
Okay,
seeing
the question is
one more
coming.
question actually. Let's take it
Yeah.
quickly before.
Do you approach your work with a sense of personal healing, or
Mm,
are you approaching it with an intent for communal
the
healing?
communal.
How
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
efficacious has it been for you personally?
Ooh. So I would say that my main orientation had been towards communal healing, but because the work by virtue of how I structured it
Mm-hmm.
has required me to be very vulnerable and very personal with it. So
Absolutely.
I would say it's absolutely been crucial for me to engage with personal healing in this area.
Mm.
I I don't even know where to begin with that. Um, there's so much I've written about this, but essentially, even the idea of myself as an artist was something that
Mm-hmm.
I had to really wrap my mind about. And there was a point when I really had to reflect on why that was. But of course, why wouldn't it be when everybody who has been presented to me as an art, growing up reading about art, you already have an idea of who is legible as an artist, right? And that's
Yeah.
not. And so when I say that this is a continual work of delinking from, Eurocentric ideas of
Mm-hmm.
art, when I say, this is a continual effort,
Yeah.
um, that is really what it is. And so if you're asking about my thesis, I reflect on that throughout. um, I decided to write it in quite a reflective manner. Um, and so, yeah, essentially, yes, both. I
Yeah.
suppose is the
Another
answer.
question just popped up. Sorry, before that, if Anthony has any follow-up question, if not, we jump to Simon Peter. He is asking, what is the relationship between art and museum collection? I know it's a
Uh,
bit a deviation from what we are talking about, but
right. Okay,
can you
sorry. Can
explain
you
a bit?
clarify just slightly? What specifically are you wondering?
The relationship between art and museum collections. So we have museum collections and then we have art,
Uh-huh.
artwork.
So are we
And
talking about art museums or are we talking about general museums?
yeah,
Which,
historical museums.
yeah.
So that's where the question is. Because historical artifacts, some of
Yeah.
them can be considered as artworks, others too are just what they are,
If
historical
we're
objects.
if we're think if the question is getting at why we consider some things art and why we consider
Mm-hmm.
some things
Some things,
artifacts,
yeah,
um, then that itself, again, is quite a colonial invention, right?
yes,
Where where a lot of the time certain institutions categorize certain things as art because they consider them to be refined or closer, to the European standards of what
yeah,
is, beautiful or less primitive, whereas other
mm-hmm.
things are categorized as artifacts because to them they are craft.
Yeah,
um, and again, this distinction is one that certain people decided to make. One thing that I like for people to understand is that all of these categories are made up, right? And because we know that they've been created, we can also unmake them if we decide
absolutely.
to. So if I'm not sure if that was the question, but
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a broad topic. It's an interesting question. A topic for an art talk on its own. On
Mm,
its, it's
mhm.
broad. It's a lot of details. So, Simon, are you satisfied with the answer? You have a follow-up question, or maybe you want to make your questions more specific? We are here. Okay. Oh, Dr. Debbie,
Hey,
has been lovely speaking to you. This is
yes, you
Diaspora
too.
Fine Art. And we had Dr. Debbie Yeboah with us,
Thank you so
who's
much
an
for inviting
educationist
me.
and a researcher and also an artist.
Mm.
And thank you, Dr. Debbie, again. If you have maybe last words, any encouragement, any contribution, anything that maybe you want to
Yeah.
let the general public know.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, yeah, I really just encourage us to be reflective in the ways in which we are engaging our own practice for those of you who are artists of various kinds. And for those of you who are interested in the arts, or collectors or institution, affiliated with institutions, um, let's move beyond the familiar and really see the ways in which art can become a useful tool to help us to understand the world in new ways, and really get to the heart of these entrenched understandings that need to be unsettled, within ourselves. Yeah, that's essentially what I try and do. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been very, very wonderful. And we are looking forward to do this again.
Absolutely.
this time in person.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our Diaspora Fine Art family. Thank you for joining us today. We are looking forward to having you again on our third edition, which is later on this year. Have a lovely, lovely day and manifold blessings. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.